All right, so we are going to be off and running through the book of Esther again, for anybody that's new and doesn't know that. Today we're going to be doing chapter 6. So if you've done the study before with me, I've done 6 and 7 together, but this week I'm going to separate it. So we're just going to focus on 6. So we did this the last 2 chapters, right? I had combined and then I separated, and hopefully I didn't leave anything lacking by not going long enough in the last 2. So there's plenty there, and there is no need to rush through that. And so that's one of the reasons I've changed that. So we always start with our review, so you know what it is we've discussed in the previous chapters that lead up to where we are today. And so back in chapter 1, we had the establishment of the time period in history that this took place, which was about 484 to 481 BCE. We talked about the king that was reigning at that time, which was King Ahasuerus. That would be the Hebrew name. The Greek name is Xerxes. So for those of you, if you're like me, I get confused when there's multiple names when I do my research to figure things out. But those 2 men are the same. So King Ahasuerus is ruling over the Persian kingdom. He does it from the capital city of Susa, and there's a reference to the actual place that he does the ruling, which is the citadel at Susa. So that would be where the palace was. That would be where the administration of everything takes place. So that was what was established in chapter 1. We also talked about something that was very significant, which was at that time, which was at the beginning of his reign, the first few years of his reign. When we look at history outside of the biblical context, we found that he spent a great deal of that time planning for battle to go back against the Greeks. And so that set the context for what the meetings were, the banquets that were talked about in chapter 1. They were military strategy planning meetings. So we looked at that as far as the historical context in chapter 1. At the end of chapter 1, we were introduced to Queen Vashti. We found out what she did or didn't do at that time. We talked about the advisors and what they told the king he should do. And basically, it's the removal of that queen. All of chapter 1 is the setup then for moving on to chapter 2, where the Jewish characters are revealed for us. And then in chapter 2, we are introduced to Esther and to Mordecai. So Mordecai is the adopted father of Esther. Esther is moved into the harem of the king, and that would be the harem in which we do the preparation to be with the king. So this is kind of like a beauty pageant taking place. And the winner of that beauty pageant is going to be the next queen. And so chapter 2 unveiled the introduction of that contest and what happened, and also about Mordecai. And at the end of chapter 2 were these 3 verses that referenced how Mordecai had uncovered a plot by 2 of the gatekeepers. They were eunuchs to the king, so it means that they were direct servants to the king, and they had a plot to take his life or assassinate him. And Mordecai saves the king's life and communicates that to Esther. And between the 2 of them, that communication saved the king's life. And that's important for what we're going to cover in the chapter today in chapter 6. In chapter 3, we were introduced to Haman, right? So as the story goes, we've been introduced to those characters that we know we're going to be rooting for. And in chapter 3, we have the character that we're going to be rooting against. So Haman is introduced to us in chapter 3, and the highlights for Haman was that he'd been elevated by King Ahasuerus. We are not told why he was elevated. That he is shunned by Mordecai. Again, we're not giving the details as to why he was shunned by Mordecai, but he displays himself to be an enemy to the Jews. And that phrase is used in regards to Haman throughout the entire book of Esther. He's the enemy of the Jews. In chapter 4, we had a display to the response of Haman's edict, which was the Jewish extermination. And that display was of what Mordecai did, the mourning that he did in the public display and the outcry. We look at the Jews mourning, and then we look at Esther's decision to approach the king. And then in chapter 5, we had the outcome of Esther approaching the king. We have the banquet that is attended. We have Haman being incredibly pleased with himself for that invite, but he turns around and he sees Mordecai sitting in the king's gate, fills him with rage. He goes home with all of that anger. He spews it to his wife and to those of his friends or advisors, and he has this comfort from them to go ahead and plan to get rid of Mordecai now. And so that's what he's planning on doing. So that's where we left the end of chapter 5. So on that cliffhanger, we come back now into chapter 6. So chapter 6, we'll do the first 9 verses, because as the story flows, it's good to get those 9 verses together. So Esther 6, verse 1 through 9. During that night, the king could not sleep, so he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows, which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Behold, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Then Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king is ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" So back in verse 1, it describes this night after this first banquet with the queen and with Haman that had happened for the king. So the king had been invited. And we're told he's unable to sleep. So in this sleepless state, he decides to have the book of records, called here the Chronicles, read to him. So we're not sure if this was what was the standard process for the king to get him to go back to sleep, or just when he's in his awake state, he decides to be productive. We don't know. We're just told he couldn't sleep. He asked for these records to be brought forward. We're going to talk about these records for just a moment because I think it's important. These are the official records. They're called the Chronicles, and they're referred to elsewhere in the scriptures, like in Ezra chapter 6 and 7. So if you want to go and do a little homework on your own, you can look at what's taught there. We'll be doing sections of that just for some highlights. These 2 chapters are the highlight of the communication between King Darius at that time and those that were requesting information. So as we read that, you'll get some of that information. There were those who were questioning if it was lawful for the Jews to be building their temple. So Darius has a search done for the records. So let's look at that in Ezra chapter 6, and I'll do the first 5 verses. So Ezra 6, verses 1 through 5. Then King Darius issued a decree, and search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon. So hold on. In Ecbatana, in the fortress, which is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and there was written in it as follows: Memorandum. In the first year of King Cyrus, Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the temple, the place where sacrifices are offered, be rebuilt, and let its foundations be retained, its height being 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits, with 3 layers of huge stones and 1 layer of timbers. And let the costs be paid from the royal treasury. Also, let the gold and silver utensils of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon be returned and brought to their places in the temple in Jerusalem, and you shall put them in the house of God. So this is what was found recorded in the Chronicles that Cyrus had written down. So here's his documentation, his record. Then when Darius is king, there's a question put forward about why are the Jews here in Jerusalem rebuilding their temple and doing all these things. So that King Darius says, go back to the records, let's find what was established, what was written, and what was decreed. So that's what they do. They go back to the records, they find the king had issued this command, and it's being followed. So back in Esther, in verse 2, the details of what was read to this king are highlighted as the Chronicles revealed how Mordecai had reported two of the king's eunuchs who were the doorkeepers. So we have Bigthana and Teresh, and how they sought to lay hands on the king. So when we read lay hands on the king, they weren't trying to give him a massage. The laying on of hands was to take his life, just so we're all clear on that. Think about this, that King Ahasuerus was in, at this point in time, the 12th year of his reign. And we saw that in Esther 3, verse 7. So the Chronicles at this time would contain the detailed records up to the point that the king is governing now. Yet, the very specific part of the records brought to the king that night deal with the heroic act of Mordecai given through the scriptures in Esther chapter 2, verses 21 and 23. Again, there are no coincidences as we read through this book. It's over and over. God's hand of providence is on every single event as it unfolds. In verse 3, the logical question from the king is, how was Mordecai honored for his loyalty? And the simple answer from the king's servants who were attending him at this early hour of the morning, it sounds like, was that nothing had been done for Mordecai. So the time period from the event of Mordecai saving the king's life that was recorded for us at the end of chapter 2 would seem to have taken place close to the time when Esther was crowned queen. We don't know that for sure because back when we made that study, remember, we just knew that it was associated with the time when the second gathering of the virgins had happened. We didn't know how long after Esther was made queen that gathering happened. It would be my assumption that it wasn't a long time. So there's no specific time of the separation of those two events. So Mordecai was, notice, already sitting in the king's gate when he saved the king's life. So we know the honor of sitting in the king's gate was not tied to this event. So whatever allowed Mordecai to have the authority to sit at the king's gate, we're not given. But we know this event was not what would have given him that right, because nothing was done for him at the time. This would have been an oversight on the king's part, as well as for those who are in service to this king. There should have been someone who made sure that this faithful act of Mordecai was acknowledged. Right? We've talked before about why Haman wants to have the gallows built. It's because we want to make a display of those who stand against the king. On the other side of that would be the same thing. When somebody does something faithful for the king, you would acknowledge that in a very public way as well to show how that should have been handled. So Mordecai basically saves the king's life. It gets written in the book of the Chronicles, so it's not like they didn't know about it. It was raised to the level to be recorded, but then somehow it fell through the cracks and nothing was done. Again, recognize the sovereign hand of God. If it had been recognized then, there'd be no cause for action to be taken now. So it may have felt at the moment like Mordecai was being slighted, but God was waiting for his ultimate time for Mordecai to be honored. In verse 4, we see that the king wants no more delay, right, for this public honoring of Mordecai. And he wants to remedy the situation immediately. And he says, who is in the court? So you feel this sense of urgency from the word use of immediately here. And the king couldn't sleep. He reads this. He wants to know what was done. Nothing. He says, well, let's take care of that right now. He doesn't say, well, let's plan next week to put that on our calendar and we'll get around to it, right? He wants to get on it right now. So we find in God's providential hand at work as we hear that Haman had just entered the outer court in the king's palace. Every detail is given for us to picture this narrative unfolding, right? Who is standing where, the inner court, the outer court, all those details have been given as we've walked through this book. Now notice, this is not the inner court, which was defined for us back when Esther entered the inner court. So it was the inner court you did not go into without being summoned. You could be in the outer court. And apparently, this is where men might hang out should they want to have an audience with the king. So it may have been on a regular basis. He would say, who's out there who wants to see me? He would be told, and he'd say, well, let so-and-so in, right? But you didn't go into the inner court without being summoned. So Haman is in the outer court. And again, this may be where people wanting to speak to the king would hang out. Would have been an interesting conversation to hear that he wants to take and hang Mordecai. This conversation that he might be having in his mind about what it is he would like to do with Mordecai. Haman was ready to move forward with Mordecai's destruction as we hear that the gallows were prepared for this event. All Haman needed was for the approval of the king. That's all he's waiting on. So both the king and Haman are in a rush to accomplish what's on their minds. Do you notice again that sense of urgency? The king wants taken care of it immediately. Haman made the decision last night. He had the gallows built. He's going to meet with the king. He wants to get it done immediately. They both have this sense of immediacy in what they want to see accomplished. So in verse 5, the servants bring their answer to the king, telling him that Haman is standing in the court. And then we hear the king summoning Haman by exclaiming, let him come in. So this would be the example in the scriptures where the king issued the summon by saying, let Haman come in. That's his summon to Haman to come into the inner court. In verse 6, Haman is brought before the king, and then a question is proposed to Haman. What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? I want those words to really permeate in your heart because we're going to hear it over and over in the next few verses. And we're going to talk about that at the end as we tie this chapter together. The heart of Haman is yet again displayed as the only thing that Haman can think is, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Do the words reflect a heart issue with Haman yet again? The king does not begin by asking Haman why he is in the court at this time. The king doesn't say, hey, what's on your mind? I've got something to talk to you about as well, right? The king doesn't even give the time of day about what Haman might have been there for. The king is focused on taking care of the business at hand for himself first. This may have just been a regular occurrence of men who wish to speak to the king again on the outer court. So there may have been other situations where the king comes to a decision, he wants something done, and so he would say to his servant, who's out there? Right? Who's in the outer court that I can give this assignment to, bring them here? So that would be him summoning them into the inner court and giving them responsibilities. Haman is distracted by his pride, thinking the king is about to honor him, so that the reason for his visit to the king of asking to kill Mordecai is now not the first thing on his mind anymore. There's been an easy shift, right? He goes in very dedicated, he was going to do this thing, and then the king brings this new carrot, let's call it, dangles this new carrot, and so Mordecai goes, ooh, carrot, I'm going to go after that, right? So he puts aside what he actually had come to the king to talk about. Remember, Haman was a very superstitious person, and we talked about that in chapter 3. Remember, as he was casting the lots, trying to determine the exact perfect day, wanted to be in alignment with all the things that he had done. So perfect time for his plans was very important. here, the king just happens to usher Haman in when Haman desired to speak to the king. So Haman may be feeling that things are really lining up for him, right? He got his counsel yesterday. He's had the gallows built successfully overnight. And now what do you know? The first thing, he just walked in. Scriptures make it very clear he had just entered in. He hadn't been sitting around for a couple hours waiting his turn. He had just walked in, and the king's summon comes for him to come forward. Everything from his measurement seems to be lining up just nicely. Notice that the king also does not reveal to Haman who he is going to honor before asking what can be done to honor. This is a parallel to Haman not revealing the people group that he wanted to exterminate when he proposed the edict to the king back in Esther 3:8. See that parallel? King doesn't say that it's Mordecai before he says what we should do. And Haman made sure not to specify that it was the Jews when he was having his conversation with the king. He just left that little detail out, just like the king does here. So in verses 7 and 8, Haman responds to the king's request. He begins it by repeating the king's words that this is to be done for the man the king desires to honor. Notice the repeated phrase we've heard previously when it came to addressing the king was what? How did Esther refer to the king when she made a request? If it pleases the king. Right? That would be the normal way to respond. And if you do a word search, you'll find there's other places in the scriptures where that phrase is used when addressing other kings. That's the common way to address it. Haman's not on that. His mind, his pride is so inflamed, he's not even doing what the normal protocol is. So he repeats the words at the beginning back to the king. In Esther 1:19, we read, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued to him. So that was one of the places in Esther we saw that. That was his own servants coming back to him with the edict after they counseled what to do after Vashti didn't come before him. In Esther 3:9, we read, if it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. So Haman knew how to use those words because he used them back in chapter 3 when trying to get what he wanted from the king. In 5:4, Esther said, if it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day. And in 5:8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king. So it's just another sign that Mordecai's pride has inflamed him to not even be following the protocol in addressing the king at this moment. Haman does not ask why the person should be receiving honor to help him find an appropriate way to honor the person. He's just jumped straight up to it must be me. You would think if the king had just asked you the question, you might say, well, who? But even if you didn't do that, you might say, well, what is the reason this person's going to be honored? That would help go into your decision for what it is they should, in what way they should be honored. Then Haman reveals the picture he has in his mind. So the first thing is that the royal robe that the king has worn should be sought out. Somebody should go through and find it, whichever robe it was. And this would honor the man in making him look like the king. Then a royal horse known to be the king's, right? It would be somebody that wouldn't just be from the royal stable. It would be something that was a stud that the king had ridden, and everybody knew this was the king's horse. When they saw that horse, they knew it was of royalty. And it says here that there was to be a crown on the horse's head. So some of the commentaries go back and forth, that's not possible, but there were reliefs that had been found that actually picture horses with a form of crown on their head. So it looks like it had been woven with their mane, like woven in so that it could stay on top of their head, just like the scriptures say here. In verse 9, everything is put together as Haman can see himself being arrayed in the robe and being lifted up on the horse, and finally led through the city square. So an extra measure of honoring was to be established, as it would not be a servant lifting the man up, but it would be one of the king's most noble princes. Remember, these are the same men who have been told by edict that they are to honor, right? Give homage to Haman. It's not enough. He wants to make sure one of them, one of the higher up ones, is the one that's seen dressing him and helping him up on the horse and then walking him around. It's just pride on steroids. It's absolutely mind-boggling. For the finale, the noble prince would proclaim for all to hear, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor," as the parade moves through the public square. There is no doubt in Haman's mind the king was going to honor him for something. There is no thought that the person going to be honored might need to receive some form of monetary reward or elevated position of any sort, because Haman had not even entertained the thought that it could be anybody other than himself, right? Haman doesn't need any money. He's very wealthy. Haman's wearing the signet ring of the king. He doesn't need any further elevation. So even in his consideration of what could be done, you realize he's given it no thought that it could be anybody other than himself. I can think the best song to describe Haman at this moment is Carly Simon's song, "You're So Vain," right? With the popular lyrics, "I bet you think this song is about you. Don't you, don't you?" That fits this man right now wonderfully, unfortunately. Haman's heart could not be filled with more aggrandizing vitriol, right? He is relishing the thought of what is about to happen to him. He began and he ended his words with the king, with the words, "the man whom the king desires to honor." It's like those words ring in his ears and he loves hearing them. So he says it at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end, and that's what's going to be spoken as he's paraded around in the public square. So that leads us to the next verses. So we're going to do chapter 6. We're going to do verses 10 through 14. Then the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting in the king's gate, and do not fall short in anything of all that you have said." So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, "Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home, mourning with his head covered. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Whew. That's a great story. That's why I love the book of Esther. Wow. So in verse 10, it demonstrates that the king likes the idea that Haman has presented, and then he assigns Haman the role of the king's most noble prince. You would think that would be like, "Oh, that's a great idea. You're the king. You're the one that I pick as the prince that's of most nobleness to do this for me." that's not what he was planning, but this should be seen as an honor that the king is bestowing on him. The king begins and it ends his instructions. Do you notice these words that are used here? As you have said, reminding Haman, this is all your idea. I love that little twist in there. The king indicates the immediate nature of what he wants done, using words like take quickly. So from the literary stance, these words are to highlight the quick pace that we feel the story is now under. It's almost like you don't read chapter 6 even when you're reading it to yourself slowly. You read it kind of fast because everything about it has that feeling of speed to it. The king then speaks the most devastating words Haman could imagine hearing by telling Haman he is to do this for Mordecai the Jew, the one sitting in the king's gate. Just to make sure of all the Jewish Mordecais that are out there in our city, I want to make sure that it's the one that's sitting in the king's gate. So he identifies the man. To add salt into this wound for Haman, the king clarifies that he wants everything carried out just as Haman had pictured it for the king. Haman has just received a mighty blow to his ego as the king is going to honor someone other than him. And on top of that, it's going to be Mordecai the Jew. The last thing Haman had been thinking about Mordecai was envisioning him hanging from the gallows that he had just built the night before. Haman's every waking thought had been about the destruction of Mordecai, and in an instant, his world comes crashing in as the king is going to honor this very Mordecai. It's not really a good time right now for the king to be asked a question about, can I hang Mordecai the Jew from the king's gate on these gallows I made last night, right? Haman's got some political savvy and thinks this is not when I'm going to ask the question I came prepared to ask. The king clearly knows that Mordecai is identified as a Jew, and we see that here in the scriptures. This would be further evidence that the king had not known or made the connection to the edict that Haman had issued regarding the Jews. The king either never knew or he had forgotten. But for whatever reason, it's very clear he knows Mordecai is a Jew. He identifies him that way. So it would make the most sense that this people group that Haman had talked about was never clarified for the king. And I'm sure Haman went out of his way to make sure that it was never clarified. King didn't need to know the details. He's left me in charge. And he sold those people to me. We don't need to clarify anything else for the king. I've got it in writing. I've got all I need. So nobody went back to clarify. In verse 11, Haman does exactly as the king has directed. I doubt that there was a lot of enthusiasm as he put the royal robes on Mordecai and he helped him up on the horse. And he probably didn't have a lot of fervor as he makes his necessary declaration as he moves through the public square. This very declaration that he had repeated to the king when he thought it was going to be words spoken of him, now he has to repeat over and over about Mordecai. You know, sometimes there just is this moment of sweet justice.
Yes.
And that's what this feels like, this moment of sweet justice. Now, it is not stated in the scriptures, but it would seem logical that Mordecai would have had to have been told why this honor is being bestowed on him. After all, this was to make up for the oversight of not honoring him 5 years earlier, right, when he had taken the steps to save the king's life. So that's not revealed here, but we could make the assumption somebody had to tell him, and it may have been Haman had to tell him why this honor was being bestowed on him. We can only speculate on what would be going through Mordecai's mind right now, right? He does not know all that has transpired overnight. Yet, and yet he did not know he and the Jews, but he did know that he and the Jews had just spent the last 3 days in the mode of fasting. So he doesn't know what's gone behind the closed doors, right? Doesn't know what happened with the king and that. He doesn't get all those details. At least the scriptures don't tell us that. The only thing Mordecai has is his own life experience. And at this moment, he's just spent 3 days in a fasting mode. And as we clarified, that would also mean praying on his knees or on his face before God for deliverance. And now, suddenly, out of the blue, the king is going to call for him to be honored. And who's doing that?
Yeah.
Haman's going to be the one to put the royal robe on me, help me up on the horse. He's the one? What is going on in Mordecai's mind? He's got to just be like, wow, Lord, when you answer really big. Wow. In verse 12, that sense of the urgency of timing continues as when all this pomp and circumstance is completed, Mordecai goes what? Back to the king's gate, right? He doesn't go home and talk about it. He doesn't set up an appointment with his photographer to make sure all the moments are captured, right? He just goes back to work. And we hear that Haman hurried home, right? We got those words again that give us the urgency. There is no detail given about Mordecai's reaction to the parade or of honor being bestowed on him, right? We hear nothing of it. It's like the scriptures just skip over it. He was loaded up, walked through the square, and then he went back to work. That's all, that we get as far as the details from the scripture. Haman is also described here as being in mourning with his head covered for his trip home. Haman is in mourning for himself, whereas just days earlier, Mordecai had been in the public square mourning for his people. In verse 13, when Haman arrives home, and this time he gathers his wife and friends to listen to him as he repeats all that's happened, right? Since they had not seen him leave or ask permission. The last time they saw him, he was leaving to go ask the king for permission to put Mordecai up on these gallows. That's the last thing they knew when he left. Now he comes home in a hurried form with his head covered, and he just reveals everything that had happened that morning. So the new information put forth by Haman now causes his advisors, they're referred to here as his wise men, and his wife to offer words of concern for Haman. Those words clearly say, if this man that you have set against is of Jewish origin, then you will not win over him, but you will fall before him. This is his own cheerleading group speaking up some reality into his life. So those within Haman's inner circle, remember, this is a group that their religious context seems to be very superstitious in nature, just like Haman was, right? Haman was the one to cast the lots to figure out what to do. So he cast the lots to take action against Mordecai and the Jews in the kingdom. And now these same men see the signs of these recent events. The signs that Haman comes back and tells them. They knew what had happened the day before. They knew about Haman being invited to the banquet. They knew how angry he was. They knew he just built these gallows. And now the recent information says, oh, and then you went there and the king did this other thing and you had to do this for that man. The very man you went to destroy, you had to honor. That's a sign. That's what they're saying here. That's a sign. Something is really, really bad. Your mojo's not good today. Right, there's something going on here, and it is not good. Secondly, it is not beyond the realm of possibility that these wise men are familiar with the history of the Jews. Let's look at Joshua chapter 2, and I'll do verses 8 through 11. So Joshua 2, 8 through 11. And it's just one example. There's multiple ones, but I didn't want to stay here until 2 o'clock this afternoon, so I did not want to include all of them. Joshua 2, starting in verse 8. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof. This is the story of Rahab, if those of you are not familiar with that story. And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, in Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. When we heard it, our hearts melted, and no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. And here's the important part. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. This was the reputation of the God of the Jews. There was plenty in history that underscored this. This was true of God's people, and some who knew the history might be familiar with this, but there was even some recent events involving the Jews that Haman's advisors may have been familiar with. So I gave you the distant one, right? The further one in history in Joshua, but back in those Ezra scriptures that we just had referred to earlier, where the request was made to go look at what the decree that had been made for the Jews to research through the Chronicles and how it had been reinstated, there's more to that story. So let's look at that as a tie-in to a more recent occurrence that these wise men may have been familiar with. So we're back in Ezra chapter 6, but now we're going to do verses 6 through 13. So listen to the story unfold. Now, therefore, Tatalmina, governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-Bozniah, and your colleagues, the officials of the provinces before the river, keep away from there. Leave this work of the house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site. Moreover, this is where we get to add, I issue a decree concerning what you are to do for these elders of Judah in rebuilding of this house of God. The full cost is to be paid to these people from the royal treasury, out of the taxes of the provinces beyond the river, and that without delay. Whatever is needed, both young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offering to the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and anointing oil as the priests in Jerusalem request, it is to be given to them daily without fail, that they may offer acceptable sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. And I issue a decree that any man who violates this edict, a timber shall be drawn from his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a refuge heap on account of this. You see that description of a man being impaled? That's what we're talking about back here in Esther with the gallows. Here are men who wanted to stop the work that the Jews were doing in rebuilding their temple in their city. And they had done everything they could to put an end to it. And so they act humble when they have an approach to King Darius, and they say, are you sure this is what they're supposed to be doing? It was pretty dangerous. Are you sure about that? And so they say, can you find where that was written down somewhere? We'd like to have the evidence of that. So he says, okay. So he searches, he finds it, he repeats what it was. Remember, that was from Cyrus. So Cyrus would be Darius's dad. And now Darius says, not only what my daddy said, but I'm going to do a decree. Now, you guys who are complaining, I'm going to make it really clear you're not to interfere in any way in terms of stopping them. Oh, and by the way, you're to pick up the cost. You're to send all their sacrifices. Don't you think those men are having a little bit of the same feeling that Haman's having back in Esther? Like, we should have just shut our mouths. Now we got to pay for it all. Not only did it not stop, now we got to fund it. Again, I think God has an amazing sense of humor. We'll end Ezra verses 12 and 13. It says, may the God who has caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who attempts to change it, so as to destroy this house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have issued this decree. Let it be carried out with all diligence. Then Tatani, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shaltar-Bozenia, and their colleagues carried out the decree with all diligence, just as King Darius had sent. Now, why did they do that? Were they suddenly in love with the God of the heavens that the Jews worshipped? Did they love following the edicts of the king? There was going to be a consequence if they didn't obey the edict of this king, and it would be to be impaled, and you would die. So they do exactly to the letter of what the king has told them to do. So King Darius was Ahasuerus' father, so this would not have been an event from long, long ago of history. This would have been an event that wise men of their day, these are men that would give counsel to Haman, right? They would give political counsel. They would give him recommendations of military, whatever it would be. They would be very educated on the recent history. They knew what had happened to these governors when they tried to stop the worship of the Jewish God. So it could be one of two reasons. It could be their superstitious nature and thinking, oh my goodness, just yesterday there was this and now this has happened. Wow, something supernatural's going on and you should be afraid, which is what they tell him. But that could also come from the fact they knew the history of the Jews and their God. So it could be both of those combined together. So back in Esther 6, verse 14, we see there's an ongoing conversation that's taking place with Haman and his advisors and Zeresh. When in verse 14, we are told there's an interruption as the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So Haman's head must be swimming with all of these events, right? Of the night before and the morning that's going on now, trying to make sense of all of it. There's been a lot of travel for this man, right? To his home and to the palace, to swing back and forth physically to one place to the other. But think about his emotional swinging as well, right? He leaves the palace happy because he got invited, but he sees Haman or Mordecai and he gets upset, and then he's going home, and then they give the counsel, and then they encourage him, and then he's going to kill Mordecai, and he builds the gallows. So he goes back to the council, the palace, all happy again, right? And then his hopes get really high when he thinks the king's going to honor him, and then they come crashing down, and now he's had to honor, and then he runs back home, right, to lick his wounds because he goes there in the morning and he's having conversation and he's trying to process it. Well, and all of a sudden there's a knock at the door and they grab him and they say, hey, it's time to go to the banquet. Come on. What kind of a mood is he in when he goes back to the palace this time? Right? Everything is swirling around as we end this chapter. Everything is like up in the air. What's going on? And it's happening fast. And what is God doing? And there's all these unexpected twists and turns to this plot. So chapter 6 is this momentous time when the narrative takes a turn. It's been building to this moment, and now it seems to take this very unique turn. These events are unfolding quickly for Haman, and in your notes, these are the words that I'm going to verify for you in each of the verses that they fall in. So in verse 1, we have that the king gave an order, right, when he couldn't sleep. In verse 4, the king's like, who's in the court? And Haman had just entered. And then in verse 5, the king said, let him come in. And in verse 10, take quickly the robes. And in verse 12, Haman hurried home. And in verse 14, while they're still talking, right? And the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman, right? Every part of this chapter is with we're moving quickly. So Esther herself, if you watch the way she acted the last time we followed what she was doing, notice that she's got a slow and a steady pace to what she's doing, right? She's been, first of all, asking for fasting for 3 days prior to making any decisions. Right? She didn't run in and grab her robes and go and stand in front of the king, right? She took her time, she processed, and she asked for the fasting for the 3 days prior. She took time to dress herself in the royal robes before being in front of the king. She took time to do the preparation of the banquet before going to see the king and asking him to come. So you see some contrast here in Esther's slow and steady pace versus Haman's quick and this immediate response or gut reaction to everything. Esther put on her royal robe. So we're going to look at some contrast now between chapter 5 and chapter 6. So in chapter 5, you had Esther put on her royal robes as she stood in the inner court, versus Haman desired to wear royal robes. Esther appears as the queen, yet Haman is dressing Mordecai to look like the king. Esther has the golden scepter extended to her, but Haman is summoned in to see the king. Esther approaches the king with a contrite heart, but Haman approaches the king with a prideful heart. The king desires to solve Esther's problem while he asks Haman to solve his dilemma. Esther has prepared a banquet for the king. Haman had prepared gallows. And if there's any other contrast you see, let me know. Those were the ones I could see that seemed to be glaring. So the suspense has been perfectly established, and the stage is set for the confrontation in our next chapter, for the real life story that's orchestrated by God. There is no question, yet again, as to God's sovereign hand leading each person and each event to their proper place in history. Several verses as a reminder of this, that God is absolutely in control of events as they unfold, so we can be reminded ourselves and be grounded in this in our modern day. Let's not lose focus. This isn't a message just then, this is a message now. So with that, let's look at Daniel in chapter 4. We're going to do 2 verses. Daniel 4, verse 17. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he bestows it on whom he wishes and sets over it the lowliest of men. Let that sink in. That's who he uses. And then in verse 35, so Daniel 4:35, all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" And Romans chapter 13, verse 1, Romans 13:1, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. From creation until the world we live in now, these are truths about God. Don't lose that focus in your daily life as you read the news, as you read whatever, as people get stirred up, try to get you off track about what's going on or what you need to do. And calm your spirit, read these verses, and know everyone, even those that we can look at and go, well, that seems pretty corrupt and evil. Every one of them has been allowed to be where they are for his purposes. And we may not get to see that on this side of eternity. So we have to trust the word when the word says God allows it. God's put them there for his purposes in ways we might never understand. God is revealing his handiwork and the true power of the world behind every person of power throughout history, all the way back to creation. God has a plan, and it's still moving forward today. The last note I want to make on this chapter is this. This repeated phrase, beginning in verse 6, as it was put forward to the king first, this is repeated 5 times in the writing. And who knows how many times it was put in the public square before Mordecai. So Haman came to the king and said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? This question asked of this king reflects in a very interesting way the king of the universe and who that king decides to honor. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 8. Ephesians 1, 3 through 8. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ, just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we would be holy and blameless before him in love. He predestined us to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intentions of his will, to the praise of the glory of his grace, which he freely bestowed on us, the beloved. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavished on us in all wisdom and insight. Do you hear the King of the universe and what he bestowed on you? He chose us according to his intentions and his will, freely bestowing on us. He lavished on us. That's our King, and that's what he's done for us. Our King, he decides who to honor in this sense, and he alone brings us into a relationship with him. So as you read this chapter again, let those words have a different meaning for you when you read about what the King does for the man that he desires to honor. That's what your King has done for you. This isn't just a story from the past with a few historical, interesting connections. This is God in his providence, protecting his people, guiding his people, recording the story. Remember, a book in which nothing's mentioned about God. And yet, every time we open a chapter, what do we find? If we seek and we look at the words in context, we go, oh, wait a minute, here's a picture of God. Over and over and over. And that is the God that we serve. There's always going to be a picture of God. In your daily life, there's a picture of God and what he's doing. Are you looking for that in your life the same way we look for it when we open another chapter in Esther? Doesn't seem to be obvious, right, when we first open the pages, but when we're done, you go, I see that in a new way now. I have a different perspective on that chapter now. That's what your day should look like. At the end of your day, do you look back and do you see the way in which God showed up for you in that day. And maybe you should keep your own chronicles of the way that he shows up in your life.